Welcome back to the Seraphine podcast and my YouTube channel. I am Seraphine Arocha, and today I am with Miss Emily Cox. Hello.
Hi.
Well, actually, I need to ask, are you going to take on the last name?
Yes.
Of
So
Nate?
I do plan to change my name, but
Nate's last name is what again?
Burien.
Oh, I like that.
Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, there's just like a weird identity thing, where it's like you've been known for this name for your whole life, and then you're just meant to switch it. And I'm also like the type of chick that's like dismantle the patriarchy. So
Oh,
I'm
totally.
like, do I take his last name? Like, I'm not sure, but
I
think I will at some point soon. But I'm also thinking of going through a rebrand.
Mm-hmm.
And right now my business and brand is based around my name. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of trying to organize a cohesive rebrand and name change at the same time.
That's a lot. And I mean, I have to say, when I first met you, for my listeners out there, I actually met Emily through her now husband, Nate. I lived in Lawrence, Kansas for about a year and a half, and he was a bartender there and loved him to death. Really great, infectious energy. If you see him around town and drink his cocktails, let me tell you, you will be a happy camper. But when we met, and we commingled in the yoga community, which was super cool. And then it's kind of interesting when you're always crossing somebody's path, but never like diving into getting to know each other too much.
Yeah.
And you've always been somebody who I've been curious to know more about, and everyone who takes your class will mention it to me and be like, oh my gosh, you'd love to take her. They speak so highly of you. And then I always like to learn from other people. So I will be in your class very soon.
Good.
So as we dive into this, you're rebranding basically what was Emily Cox Wellness, right? Mm-hmm. Which has been a really, for what I perceive as a very successful kind of branding of what a yoga wellness coach is. That how you would define it?
Yeah, well, so technically I'm a nutritionist, but the business itself is wellness, and there is definitely a coaching element to it. So I think that's great terminology to describe it.
So how are you hoping to rebrand?
Well, I'm going through some kind of spiritually awakening changes, I suppose, myself. And so I want to bring those into the business a little bit and help it become a little bit more of a nutritional therapy tool for people and more intuitive eating-based habits than just this traditional model of like medical nutrition therapy. So I just have noticed these themes amongst my clients and kind of figuring out what works and doesn't work over the last 5-6 years that I've had this business going. And so I'm kind of trying to utilize those tools and weave them into, again, like a more cohesive kind of model that people resonate with.
So you're a 500-hour, what a lot of people in the community love to refer to as like a master kind of yoga certification. I always think it's so funny when we have to put like different titles on what we consider to be a mastery of a skill. I definitely think when it comes to the understanding of what yoga is, I mean, you are really well-rounded. You have traveled. I think you started, if I'm right, your 200-hour was actually in Bali?
In India.
In India, okay.
Yeah.
So,
the homeland.
Which was, I mean, it must have been pretty intense to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you have the means and the time to do that, I think that's the best way to learn, in my opinion. There's a lot of different ways that people can learn, and obviously kids and jobs and whatnot keep you bound to the confines of your reality for sure. But in that moment of my life, I was able to travel to India, and so I spent 6 weeks there, and it was full submersial. So, I mean, that was really awesome because I feel like with a lot of teacher trainings that are here, it's like once a month for 9 or 10 months. And so there's a lot of in-between period, like 3-4 weeks in between each session where you can kind of apply that or lose it, depending on what type of person you are. And some people dive head first and take class and do all the readings and everything, but some people don't, And so I think that for me, it was really awesome to be just fully submersed in that culture and, talking with the Ayurvedic doctors and the Himalayan monks and all the people who were there. And so that experience really laid the groundwork for, I feel, my sort of traditional take on yoga.
Did you have at any moment when you were in the training, like a moment where you were like, I'm out of my depth?
Not necessarily. I mean, I had traveled before and I lived in Peru for 6 months. And so I felt fine being there. Obviously I missed my people and whatnot, but no, I didn't feel like I was necessarily out of my depth. Actually, I feel like So it was an Ashtanga Vinyasa training. And for people that aren't familiar, Ashtanga is like the oldest form of yoga. And if you've done any form of yoga, you've done Ashtanga, was what I always tell my students, because it's all rooted in that lineage. And I was already a pretty seasoned Ashtanga practitioner when I went and got my training. I had been practicing for 4 years, which is not a ton by any means at all. But I was surprised going down there that a lot of people had never been exposed to Ashtanga and actually had no clue what it was. And so I was like, what? You signed up for this training, but like had no clue that this was what it was. And so maybe they looked up a video or something like that ahead of time. But that was the extent of their, sort of Ashtanga knowledge. And so if anything, I actually felt like I was helping to kind of guide some of the people while I was there, at a minimum through my like physical asana-based practice, not necessarily the philosophy and origins and whatnot, but yeah. So
I think the hardest part for me when I began my training was we learned Ashtanga first and foremost. It was right out the door, and it was the Sanskrit for me.
Yes.
I actually now it's terrible to say I can teach an Ashtanga class, but I can barely use Sanskrit. So I cue correctly. It's just when I try to remember the multi-syllable Sanskrit, I'm like, oh my gosh, wait a second. Do I say it? And that was the other thing, is getting over the mispronunciation and then the embarrassment of like, oh my gosh, feeling like imposter syndrome, even though the practice of yoga in and of itself, it doesn't matter whether or not you pronounce. I mean, it's nice to know the Sanskrit words, but at the end of the day, if you understand, I think, the principles behind it and really teach it from a true place in your knowledge background in your heart, I'm like, it's okay.
Yes, absolutely. This is something I talk with so I lead the teacher training at Maya Yoga, which is my home studio, and it's an Ashtanga studio. And this is something that I talk with a lot of my students about, is we're all butchering Sanskrit. And it's just hilarious to see people kind of get caught up in that, because I'm like, no one's doing a good job. Even if the people feel like they're doing a good job, you're not. It's like pronounced not phonetically necessarily. So even Sanskrit is spelled, Sanskrit, and it's actually pronounced like Sanskruta or something like that. And so you look at the words and you try your best to phonetically pronounce them the way that you were taught in school, but it's just not something we were taught, and our tongues don't do that necessarily. So,
no, they don't.
And they'll get hung up, and they'll say, Purvottanasana versus Parsvottanasana, and it's like, none of your students know that you've messed that up, so just keep going.
100%. And I think even more so, I don't know if you would agree with me on this, but I had felt right before we got into the COVID pandemic world, especially with all of what was going on socially, I feel like the whitewashing of yoga really got a beating. I mean, there was so many documentaries that were out, like revealing how people had come in and abused the system and abused yoga practitioners to come in to learn the practice of yoga. And then in and of itself, just the whitewashing of the material of learning it. Mm-hmm. And it became for myself a come to quote unquote Jesus moment of the why I'm doing this, and then also trying to not get in the way of being too precious. Just like when, you're having a teachable moment in like systemic racism, right? We get very much like, well, I'm not that way. I don't, formally, I would get really defensive about it. And now I realize, no, it's actually okay to have a moment and have somebody who might actually know more than you. And you take a moment to pause and listen. Did you have any of those moments in the last couple of years where you're like, okay, I was feeling really confident about my teaching and where my foundation is, but wow, I have a lot to learn?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the more I've gone through my personal practice, because I mean, that's a big piece of it, is that you're always a student, regardless of how equipped you are as a teacher. And so that's something that's been definitely humbling. In the beginning, I felt more like I needed to prove something. Yeah. And now I feel like it's just so easy to be like, okay, well, what do you have to say about that topic? And how can I pull that and learn from you and add that into my ideology or framework for how I teach my classes? And so I feel like I'm always learning from my students, and I'm also always learning from my teachers. So yeah, I definitely feel like as I've progressed through my teaching career, I've sort of been humbled by those kind of more rigid frameworks of the way that people kind of think about the whitewashing of yoga or concepts of how, you know, you're better than somebody else because you teach a certain type or whatever the case may be.
What was the most different from your 200 hour to adding on with the 300 hour?
So I feel like the 200 hour is really like the basics. It's like the template for how you will evolve as an instructor. And then the 300 is where it's almost like your bachelor's degree versus your master's degree. You know what I mean? And so then going through my 300 and even beyond has been more just refined, and it's been focused on, you know, how can I improve my teaching from a philosophical standpoint? Now we know how to, you know, coach people through how to get into postures, right? That's the basics of the 200 hour, getting in front of a group of people and feeling confident enough to speak about how to move their body. And then 300 is like, okay, how can we take this one step further and really allow these people to deepen their practice and connect with themselves more intensely. So
you, the other thing is you've taken it steps further, because again, in your training, in your 200 to your 300, there is touching on Ayurveda, but you even take it a step further of you have a nutrition degree, correct?
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about how you became curious, why you brought that to your practice as a practitioner, but also in your business.
For sure. So when I was in India was probably some of my first exposure to Ayurvedic principles in general. That was a part of my training. It was Ashtanga, Vinyasa, Pranayama, which is breath work, and then Ayurvedic principles. Because Ayurveda is the sister science of yoga, for people who aren't familiar. And I know that you know a lot of this, but we'll just be reiterating all of it for the listeners.
Yeah.
But so when I was there, I was just really enamored with all of the beautiful colors and the herbs and the way that the doctors would communicate about this holistic kind of framework of healing. And on top of that, my stepfather, who has been a really big influence in my life and has been more of a father to me throughout my entire life than anything else. And he got really sick. And for years was misdiagnosed by Western medical doctors as having a GI disorder, essentially. But it was idiopathic. They didn't know what it was causing it or where it was coming from. And then he ended up starting to go to more Eastern medical doctors. And 10 years down the line, after being misdiagnosed all these different times and taking all these pharmaceuticals and just stripping his microbiome of beneficial bacteria and whatnot, he found out that he actually had 17 parasites and 3 tapeworms in his stomach.
Wow.
And so the fact that the doctors missed this, I mean, obviously this is 10 years ago, and this, GI health has dramatically evolved since then, but it was appalling to him that this wasn't found earlier, and that it, a parasite from traveling could have grown and proliferated to such a degree that he would become so incredibly ill. Wow. And so that story, coupled with my kind of basic education of Ayurveda, kind of inspired me to do, when I got back from India, what was called the Institute of Integrative Nutrition. I went through their holistic health coaching program, and I was looking into master's degrees, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to go that route yet, and if I wanted to spend all of that money and that time and dedication. And so I went through the health coaching program because it was a year and it was much more affordable. And from there, I got, again, sort of like this basic understanding of nutrition principles, kind of in the same way that you go through your 200 hour, and was like, okay, I need to know everything. So then I went on and got my master's in nutrition and was kind of trying to figure out more, again, kind of as I mentioned earlier, ways to cohesively bring people to deepen their physical practice and also deepen their emotional, mental, health-based practices as well. So just kind of bringing those two worlds together, because it's all connected.
It's so interesting. I actually had one of my students come up and talk to me a little bit about her own kind of discovery into her own gut health, just what her body has experienced and what it actually needs to heal. And she was talking to me about folic acid and how, she was asking, what kind of folic acid do you take? And then she was like, I don't mean to be gross, but when I went to the bathroom, she was like, you would die if you knew what is inside of your gut health. So I've got a few questions for you. Okay. So what are things that you think that most people kind of blow off and they say, you know what, I'm just tired today, or you know what, my stomach's just a little, it's a little irritated, maybe I had too much dairy. What do you think are the signs of when you're like, no, actually you should probably look in a little deeper of what's going on with you?
Okay, so I mean, stool, big one, easy peasy. If your stool is not solid by any means, or if you're diuretic or constipated, or just your digestion in general is abnormal or irregular, I think that's a good sign that something might be amiss in your gut or even someplace else. But that's a good sign that something's going on inside your body. Also, anything from an external perspective, like skin rashes or like wobbly nails or like dry skin, dry hair, anything like that, eczema, psoriasis, all that stuff is a sign that your microbiome could be potentially off. And the reason for this is that the liver detoxifies and the body detoxifies outward. And so the extremities are often symptoms or hold symptoms of what's going on from an underlying perspective. So the extremities, such as the hands, arms, face, feet, legs, etc., will oftentimes develop rashes or inflammation or blisters or things like that if something's going on. So that's another one. And then outside of that, I tell all of my clients and patients and whatnot to keep a symptom log. Uh-huh. And so if after you eat any food at all, if you feel any type of way except a little bit more full, even if that means you got a little bit of bloating, your digestion was off, if your eye starts twitching, if you get a headache, if your mouth starts to kind of swell up or become a little itchy, anything like that, anything at all really besides being more full is a symptom that your body's not responding properly to the foods that you're ingesting, or that you're having some sort of allergic acute response to some sort of, dietary habit that you're involved in. So is that kind of
completely. Okay. And I love hearing about it. I think for me, a lot of times I'm so interested the older I've gotten, because I'm at that like 44 perimenopausal age. I have brain fog a lot, and I get a little bit, there's a sleepiness now and things like that. And I've been really interested in reading more and more about like what I can do to help, as opposed to, going to a doctor, like a therapist or a psychologist, psychiatrist, and say, well, is it because of this, this, and this? And a lot of times, not only is it not just situational, it's actually what you're putting in your body.
Right.
I think so many people want to make it about like, well, if this is going on in my life, I mean, yes, I completely understand that there are situations to where it's not just dietary.
For sure,
but it definitely helps to know that what you're putting in your body can contribute to the things that might get in your way on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I can't wait to pick your brain some more. This little feisty one is like ready to go down. We're going to have part 2 of our conversation. It's going to be a 3-parter with Miss Emily Cox, and we'll see you here on this flip side.